Welcome to Transforming Relationships. I'm Dr. Eric Spiegel, and with me is my co-host, Dr. David Alter. And today we're incredibly fortunate to have with us Naseem Khuri. And Naseem is a facilitator and educator specializing in negotiation, influence, and conflict management. Naseem has founded and works with a variety of organizations that help people manage internal and external conflicts and improve how they collaborate with others. Clients include state legislators from all 50 states, Israeli and Palestinian officials, and U.S. Navy SEALs. Thankfully, not all at the same time. He also teaches international negotiation at Georgetown University and the Fletcher School at Tufts University. He lives in Silver Spring, Maryland with his wife and two young, very energetic children. And you have to have a wellspring of energy to do the work that Naseem does. So we're incredibly happy to have you here on the show with us. I also want to put in a plug for your recent Substack called Fight Well, where you share thoughts on the state of our discourse and how we can all fight better. Welcome to the show, Naseem.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you here with us. We were talking before the show about the wide-ranging topics that we're going to be discussing today with the unifying theme, and I think it's probably always a curiosity when we have guests outside of the therapy field of why did we invite you here? And of course, we invited you here to talk about relationships and their capacity for unity, their capacity for disunity, and how we can bring the best of us in relating and in facilitating better on individual, communal, and societal levels. David, I know you had some thoughts on that theme. What would you like to add before we start asking Naseem our wide and long list of questions?
Well, for me, what is really drawing me to, Naseem, what you do, it is that conflict is actually an essential characteristic of human relationship, right? The ideal isn't peace all the time, happy ever after, blah, blah, blah. Conflict is essential. Conflict is an engine of growth and change. But we know, unfortunately, it can also be incredibly destructive to murderous. So I'm really curious how in your role you help navigate that line so conflict, difference can orient toward growth, connection, and healing, and away from the rather dark way in which people often deal with conflict. So that's where I'm coming from.
Cool. I'm also curious about that. No.
Maybe we'll all find it together in the course of the interview. And maybe that's actually a good place to start. Is in the origin story. Essentially, what drew you to this field? I know as a psychologist that there are elements in the work that I do that speak to my own lived experiences. What can you share with our audience about your life experiences and how they drew you to the work that you do?
Sure. I've realized lately that the passions I have always been embedded in me somehow, and it's just a matter of whether I realized it or not. So I remember from a very young age being around conflict in the sense that watching my dad watch TV, basically. I have vivid memories of my dad watching the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour on PBS and yelling at the TV. Because he was always watching news. And at the time, this was the 80s, Lebanon was often in the news. Now, my parents grew up mostly in Beirut. They had very close connections to it. So it was always in my house. It was always just in the walls that we were always talking about this, the conflict and the tragedy of Lebanon in the 80s. And so that's sort of always been there. And I remember going to college and sort of getting away from that. And I went to a small liberal arts college in Maine, which was the furthest thing from Lebanon, and having two roommates who were fighting with each other all the time, and finding myself acting as mediator between them. And I found that role to be really comfortable. I was at college, so that was sort of another indicator. Finally, I spent college basically in the laboratory. I was pre-med, so I was a biochemistry major, and I spent a ton of time in the lab. And only until senior year, I realized that, like, hey, really, I'm not that into this stuff. I'm not that into science. There's actually one topic that I'm actually interested, which is immunology, and I'm interested in how the body sort of deals with conflict. And senior year, I realized, actually, wait, I'm interested in conflict outside the body, not necessarily inside of it. And so it was this question of I've always been interested in that sense around how people are disagreeing, why they're disagreeing, and what they do about that disagreement, and how they handle that disagreement, whether it's an extreme case like watching footage of Beirut in the 1980s, or it's two roommates just battling over, who came home too late or whatever. But it's always been there. And I always find myself, again, the things that I realize now I've been passionate about for a long time. It's the things you keep thinking about and the things I was doing in my free time. So I would come home from, come back to my apartment from organic chemistry class, or come back to my dorm, I should say, from organic chemistry class, and then look up what's happening in Israel, Palestine, and read about that for hours, and not actually follow up on organic chemistry. And so that was an indicator of where my passion was at. So those seeds have been planted for a long time, and it finally took a little while to realize that maybe I can actually work in this place, or spend a little more time here, and try to figure it out. How do you actually do this work? What does that actually look like?
Since you drew that parallel between, the roommates that have a misunderstanding and it boils over into conflict, and Israel Palestine, what metaphor do you think our listeners and viewers could extrapolate from, how coexistence can go horribly wrong, and also how it can be repaired between two roommates? How can that apply to the conflict? What are your thoughts about that process?
I don't know about a metaphor. I do know that I'm struck by something, David, you said just a minute ago, which is around what are we, when we use the word conflict, what are we actually sort of using, and what do we actually mean? And Eric, you said earlier, use the term, the capacity for disunity. And I'm struck by both of those, because those are questions I'm grappling with all the time. Is we need conflict. Conflict provides it's a huge source of learning for us all the time, right? It's just like we learn from failures, right? We learn from conflict in the same way. And too much or unproductive conflict is incredibly dangerous and harmful, and etc. And so the question is, well, where's the balance, and what's healthy conflict in that sense? It goes to this question that a lot of us in this field struggle with, and use different terminology. For example, are we talking about conflict resolution? Well, I've always had a problem with that word, resolution, because conflict resolution can just mean that I punch you in the face, you get knocked out, and we're done, we're resolved, right? Oftentimes people don't mean it that way. They mean some sort of resolution where the relationship works out fine, and we can go forward together and hold hands and walk into the sunset. But I've never been comfortable with it because A, it means that first thing that I said, but B, it also, conflict can sometimes never be resolved. It can never go away. It's always simmering. It's always there. And it's a question of when it comes back up. So then do you use another term? Do you use conflict management? That's always a term that I've kind of liked. It's something to be managed. But at the same time, a very cynical perspective on that is we see it play out in sort of war zones, where one sort of more powerful force can be seen as managing a conflict by sort of keeping it in place. and keeping war in place. And so another one is conflict transformation, right? And where you're actually trying to transform it. But if there was healthy and good aspects about the conflict, do you want to transform that too? So I'm just sort of spewing out some of the debates that we've had in my world around what's the appropriate usage of that word, because we're not quite sure what is the healthy amount of conflict, and we're not quite sure what to do. How do you extract the benefits of it without straying into the really harmful sort of side effects or really harmful effects of it?
So a question, okay here, Eric?
Yeah, go for it, David.
A question that has sort of been germinating based on your introducing the idea of Naseem's origin story and then how you have been responding to it. You talked about witnessing Dad doing battle with the TV.
Yeah.
You talked about
sometimes literally. Yeah.
the conflict that you walked into the middle of between two roommates, and now in your career, different forms. You talked about managing, resolving, and transforming. I've always been struck by the prefix RE, resolving, meaning again. So the assumption to me is the conflict is going to be there again and again and again and again. We're resolving. So to me, the question I'm asking you is, as you enter into a conflict, are you gauging sort of what the conflict is calling you to do? Are they asking you to come in and help figure out a way to manage, to transform, to resolve? Or is it more that you have your own idea about what is needed? How do you go back and forth between what the conflict is calling for versus what you are bringing? Right? Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah. I would add a third one, which is the people who are involved in the conflict. What are they asking you to do? Which is how I initially heard your question.
That's what I was actually intending.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So, oftentimes the perception of what I think needs to be done is different than what the people think need to be done. I'm sometimes called in because a team within an organization, and I'm not talking about countries or wars or anything like that. Literally, a team within an organization is having issues, and I am called in because they will say, "Hey, our folks are fighting internally. Come and fix it," right? And I will have to then assess what fix it means, and this question: what is the appropriate level of conflict that this group can withstand before it becomes unproductive? What's that tipping point between productive and unproductive? And that might lead to this sense of, I'm going to come in and my purpose might be different. My purpose might not be to fix it, because what does that mean? I don't think this is going to be fixed. You're talking about, I recently worked with a group, with a union where there's huge generational divide, and the older folks thinking that the younger folks don't know how this system works, and they are too wild and they're asking for too much, and we, the older folks, know how the relationship works with the company. And meanwhile, the younger folks are like, you guys have sold us down the river. You're not fighting hard enough, etc. Now, in those cases, I'm not going to resolve that conflict. I'm not going to resolve the sort of major different ways in which they're looking at the same data, right? One thing that we see over and over again is we will look at the same exact thing and interpret it differently, right? Based on our experiences and based on which information we're actually selecting to look at on that thing.
It's especially relevant today.
Right. Totally. And so, I'm not going to fix that. What I am going to do is I'm going to say, okay, what's the way that we can navigate out of this situation so that you can all go back to your mission? You're a mission-driven organization. How do you go back to doing that mission and not be distracted by this conflict that is actually that you're subsumed by now? And that might mean a slightly different purpose. That might mean we're just trying to understand each other here. And I'm not trying to convince you, and I'm not trying to negotiate with you. We are just trying to understand each other a bit more, and then let's figure out next time, what does that actually look like? If we can build some sort of foundation of understanding, what does that actually look like for how we're going to actually figure out how to work together going forward? So those purposes might be different. They might have this grand illusion of, we can solve this, we can resolve this, and it'll all be fine going forward. But it's just like any like medical condition that like doesn't go away, right? It'll flare up once in a while, and you have to figure out how you're going to manage it when it does flare up. And so that might lead to a different set of purposes.
Right. Yeah.
But we're already going deep into the weeds here, Eric. I don't know if you had more origin story questions or what.
I'll be honest with you. I've been slightly distracted by my daughter yelling in the hallway and wondering if that's going to pick up on our audio. And maybe that's a metaphor, like I keep saying metaphor here, right? Maybe that's like your father yelling at the TV. And that actually informs my question, right?
Nice.
What do you do? Speaking of getting in the weeds, what do you do, right, when you have one or two parties that are just interested in yelling at each other? And maybe they have good reason to do that. How do you get them from yelling to talking? And how do you get them from talking to empathizing?
First off, I think it, again, is critically important to understand what your purposes are. I'm not going to say we're going to move from yelling. Yelling might actually be really helpful in that moment, right? It all depends. Like, we might need to vent. You might need to kind of scream at each other because the other person won't hear it any other way. What I want people to do when they're doing that is to, one, be thoughtful on why they're doing that and be purposeful on it. But even if they're not, even if it is a purely sort of visceral, impulsive reaction, then I, as a third party, I, as a sort of facilitator who's trying to hold the room and hold the space, I've got to think through, is this going in the right, is this actually helpful right now? And sometimes people, the metaphor, speaking of metaphor, the metaphor people use in my world is the pot boiling over, right? We want the pot to boil. We want the water to boil. But is it going over? But we need it to boil a bit, because we will not surface the underlying issues unless it boils. And yelling might be the best way to surface those underlying issues, because too often I deal with folks where there are simmering, like really deep-seated, complaints that are going on that never come out because everyone's polite, or because they have too many protocols and processes in place that prevent that from coming out. I'm all about process. I can talk till the cows come home about the importance of process. Mm-hmm. And there's a downside to too much process. And I've been to too many meetings that are too structured, such that I actually don't know what we're talking about. I don't know what the real issue is. I don't know why you have this problem. And I will hear it on one-on-ones, but it will never come out in our sort of system that we've built here. So yelling might be important in that sense. That's just sort of one reaction to that. And then it's this question of, can you design, if in fact you realize in the moment that actually, no, yelling is not that helpful here, and we need to move to a better place, and we need to actually work towards understanding or whatever we're trying to do, then it is a question of, can I design the appropriate process to allow that to happen in a way that people can retain their own autonomy, preserve their dignity, and make sure that they get heard in a certain way. Because to me, yelling is a great indicator that someone doesn't feel heard. And so we have to figure out what's a system that we can build here together to allow that to happen. Does that make sense?
It does. Keeping in mind the confidentiality of your clients, can you give us an example that would better illustrate the distinction between boiling and boiling over?
Yeah. I had one.
It could be a hypothetical, but something that might make it more clear, like that process-based distinction that you're extrapolating.
Yeah. Okay. The union I mentioned that I worked with, that was a case of boiling. where it was very helpful, where that was the generational divide, where it was very helpful for, in this case, the older generation, an older gentleman, to just start screaming in the room at a few of the younger folks. In that moment, it was helpful because it surfaced the real issues. And I, as a facilitator, the discipline was not reacting to the tone, but figuring out in what he just said, he actually just revealed a bunch of interests and a bunch of stuff he really cares about. Let me pick up on that and let me make sure that he feels heard in that sense. Mm-hmm. So did a lot of yelling, and before the other guys could sort of fight back, I was just like, wait, say more about that. You just mentioned that you care deeply about this. That's important to you, right? And so and then he eventually sort of came down a little bit, but that was a really helpful case of boiling because it surfaced the issue. Another example, the overboiling or boiling over, mm-hmm. Was from an international organization that I worked with, an international NGO that we've heard of, that we were sort of facilitating a hard conversation amongst them. And this was a case where I had them do something that to them, like literally a little exercise. And they interpreted that exercise, a few people interpreted that exercise as amplifying the divisions that they already had. And then they sort of shut it down. That was a case where they started yelling at me as a facilitator and yelling at my colleagues. And that was a case where we did not, and as I look back, we did not build the appropriate process to allow for that, right? And so they start yelling and it shuts it down. It boils over because we can't then contain it, and it shut down the meeting. We had to end it. And so that's a case of boiling over where it could not be constructive and we could not steer our way back to a better place from it. Does that make sense? Is that work as a analogy?
Yeah, it really does.
Examples.
What I was reacting to as the two of you were going back and forth around Eric's question is that in our work with couples, in our work with families, so we're now taking what you're describing on the international scene and I'm taking it into the clinical office.
Yeah.
Groups too, David. I do a lot of group work.
And groups. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Eric. Appreciate that. What I was struck by is a theme that I often use, that in order for this, whether it's a group, a couple, or an individual, for the work that we do to be effective, we have to display what I call multilingual fluency. Mm-hmm. There are multiple languages that are going to be used. One language is volume, right? I don't know. I'm not even worried about what the words are. It's just the intensity, the volume.
Yeah.
There's the body language. There are the words. There's the affect attached to the words. And what I find I often have to do is help clients listen beneath the volume, listen beneath the intensity. So even a practice like, can you do me a favor? Can you say to your partner exactly what you just said, but can you whisper it? Mm. And when they do, they find they can't say it because without the intensity, it evokes something different. So what I'm amazed by is in this process orientation that you have, all the different ways that you can take what's in the room, the multiple languages, the multilingual patterns, and through different adjustments, allow that process to result in being heard, being seen, and therefore a building block or a stepping stone to what might come next.
Yeah.
So that's how I, as a therapist, am relating to what you're describing. Does that make any sense?
I love that. And one difference, I think, is that I have the luxury of being the facilitator in that sense. So I can sort of inject myself in that way. I'm not counting on them nor asking them to do that whispering, right? I'm sort of taking that and saying, and sort of reframing and then steering the ship in that sense. Um, and I'm able to do that. Hopefully, if I do my job right, I've gained the trust for the group to allow me to do that and to come along when I do that. But it does require a bit. It does require that trust for me to be able to inject that and then steer a conversation in a certain way. And I sort of do that volume adjustment myself as opposed to having them do it. Right? It's a luxury that I get.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a critical follow-up question, which is, how do you build the trust? What are the kind of subtle ways that you build trusts, maybe even before an official intervention and then during it? Because it's, I guess something I was really taking from the conversation so far is that, different parties have different temperatures. For one party, that yelling is, like David was saying, is just getting it at a volume enough where they can hear their feelings. But to another party, that could feel tremendously unsafe. So how do you build the trust to kind of account for those differences?
Yeah, I think it goes back to, for me, it goes back to how deliberate were we in setting up processes that allowed us to create that trust. So I think about situations, clients I've had, work I've done with groups and with people, and where I have had that trust is because we were very deliberate in how we entered the space in the first place. We made sure that we'd had some critical mass, but not too many people. We had to make sure it was in a sort of a space that was conducive to this. And maybe that person's office was not conducive to this. And this sterile boardroom is not conducive to this, but this sort of retreat center is much more conducive to, like, whatever, but being thoughtful on the actual processes of how you do that. And I think back to that NGO where it all fell apart. It was a bad process that and it's something I regret. It was a bad process because there was too many people in the room. The right people weren't in the room. I didn't have the relationships in advance before I asked the group to start doing things. And so all of that I needed to be able to build some individual relationships within a process to be able to have that trust. Right. Mm-hmm. Also, I find I am more successful at steering groups in a certain way after we've gone through some sort of journey together. And that journey often is some sort of training or some sort of learning that we can all do so that we can adopt some common language and common vocabulary between us so that we can get to know each other outside the context of me asking you to do really hard things. All I'm asking you to do now is learn and listen and try to, experiment with these tools I'm giving you and some cool ideas and things like that. But I'm not asking you to reach, deep inside your soul and bear it out here and then try to resolve a conflict with someone else right now with that person that you hate and you've been hating them for the past year. I'm not asking you to do that now. What we're doing here is learning. And so I need to sort of create that journey, but oftentimes I am more successful when I create that journey, like a training or lessons or something like that. We can all go through that journey together. And then when we come out of that, I both have built up relationship. I have a bit more trust from them. I have their commitment that they will try to work on these things that we just talked about. And I will have a common vocabulary that we can all use so that in the moment when we are deep in the weeds and we are really sort of going at it, I can be like, remember what we just did 3 hours ago. And remember this word that we said we were going to try hard to use. And remember this, really trying hard to figure out why you're, being self-aware of why you're yelling at them right now. Like I can sort of make those meta moves in the moment after we've gone through that journey.
David, I have a follow-up question, but it would kind of pivot us. So I don't know if there's something you want to ask right now, but
I'll ask.
Sure.
We'll see. I'll ask this and we can go with it or not.
Okay.
As you were talking about building trust, picking up on the question that you introduced, Eric, and what Naseem's methods and technologies and tactics are to create it. What I found myself thinking about is the idea of identity and truth. Okay. So in the room, I know who I am and I believe I know who you are. Those are my truths. But truth to me as a clinician is a constructed belief system that exists only as long as those beliefs continue to be supported and experienced as the only way to understand what's happening. And what I sense you're doing is by building things that create a sense of trust, people can look at what they believe their and your identity is, the truth attached to that, and start to say, maybe, I wonder if, could it be that? So they start to move away from the rigidity, the ossification of the truth, which otherwise pits us against one another. So is that a fair extraction of what you're doing? Is at some level working with the trust building so that you can move away from these rigid identity-based truths that are anathema to any forward movement?
Yeah, I think one of the things, if I'm able to convince people to do a training with me first before we get into the hard stuff, one of the things I will talk about is the danger of certainty,
Yeah.
and how being certain about and having our own truths, and making sure that all we're doing is sort of supporting, finding ways to add more armor to our truths, will just make it that much harder to deal with other human beings. And so I'll talk about both the dangers of being so certain on this, and then we have to think about what we're asking them to do when we're coming off of that certainty. I'm not asking you to sacrifice on your identity. I'm not asking you to compromise on your dignity. I'm not asking you to do any number of things that, if I say, I don't want you to be certain on this, you might think I'm asking you to do. I do believe it is possible to be a little bit uncertain and still hold fundamental beliefs and values and not compromise on those things. Because those values and those beliefs are going to inform how you're then going to approach this conversation. And you've got to be able to do it in a way that allows a little bit of flexibility so that you can, again, engage with other human beings who are going to be slightly different from you.
Right. Right.
But yeah, totally.
How do you subtly build flexibility? I loved your statement, the danger of certainty. So how do you make it less dangerous, and how do you make it more curious? And that's one of David and my favorite words. How do you make it more curious for people to be flexible?
I think for one thing, it's understanding, really doing an investigation of ourselves, and our beliefs, and the beliefs that we hold to be sort of sacred, and whether we believe ourselves in a vacuum, in a room with no windows and in a room with no distractions. Do I believe this thing? And if the answer is yes, great. Do I believe every single aspect of this thing? Do I believe in all of the ways in which this thing manifests? In other words, I might believe in, let's take a hot topic, gun safety, gun control, whatever you call it. I might believe in the fundamental right for myself to bear arms, and I might believe in the fundamental right of personal liberty, and I get to make the choices here. And do I believe in every single policy that has been used, that those beliefs have informed over the past 30 years? Do I believe that we should ban bump stocks? Do I believe that we should, whatever the policy of the day is? And that's where I want the investigation to happen, right? Because you can still believe in those fundamental beliefs that I talked about, like, personal liberty, etc. And is it possible that there is some wiggle room on how that manifests in terms of like policy or solutions or tactics or anything like that? And that's where I find that there is, like, I don't need to die on the hill for this exact specific type of tactic. I think that I can meet my interests with and hold my fundamental beliefs while that tactic shows up slightly different. And that's what I mean. Like when I'm in the room by myself, can I do that investigation and figure out what I truly believe? It might be that some of those policies, no, I'm not giving an inch on that. But this other thing, I don't actually care how that happens. I care about the idea behind it. The other thing to take into account is if there are other people in the room trying to get you to think a certain way, that introduces a whole new way, a whole other way of thinking about things, because oftentimes we are going to be reacting to that person and not necessarily to the topic, right? I'm going to be pissed at how this person is trying to change my mind, because autonomy is really important to me and I need to be able to make up my own mind.
And I was just going to say, and it's going to, of course, take us away from the agenda, but we'll get there because
it's more fun that way.
Yeah, you brought up something domestic. I was thinking about, and this is something really close to home for David because David lives in Minneapolis. But I was thinking about how the whole process of the ICE escalation in Minneapolis happened, and when you were giving that example, Naseem, it was reminding me of these moments in the life of that where perhaps people who, may have beliefs about, there has to be a process of legal immigration and they have to go through legal channels. And, if somebody's here undocumented, they should, have to go through a process, and how there were things in what actually happened that created potential challenge points to those doctrines of belief. And two, I think, really good examples of that were the two shootings and killings. So, the first one, Renee Good, she's, and there's some people have disagreement about that, but she's trying to get away from the situation, right? And, you have some people saying, hey, unarmed person shot. And then other people saying, well, but was she unarmed or was she trying to get away? So I think it's like, hey, stay with your team. Don't come over here. Stay with your team. And then I think that was really evident with Alex Preddy, because you could see how there are these conventional narratives. And then it's like, oops, wait a second. He's a gun owner. And then you have the people who believe in the Second Amendment. So, oh, wait a second. I shouldn't be shot for my right to carry. But then, you see people saying, stay on your team, stay on your team. So I'm just curious kind of what you think about that and how that applies to your example.
This goes to something that I think is one of the more important things. It's one thing that we all talked about earlier, which is the importance of nuance. And the importance of embracing complexity. And the Preddy example, I think, is a great example, as you're saying, of people really struggling to reject complexity and fit it into our nice narratives. And the facts of the case made that really hard for people. It's like the facts of that case said, like, are just begging for people to embrace complexity and to be able to hold multiple views that don't necessarily fit in one beautiful narrative. I think that to me is such, if we don't have the capacity for such complexity, for such nuance, if we don't have the capacity to hold seemingly competing ideas at the same time in our brains, then we will condemn ourselves to unproductive conflicts going forward. Then it is just about a power struggle. Then it is about zero understanding. It's about which side wins. And then it's about having a class of people who are continually weak and unheard. And what kind of society does that lead to? And so that's a great example of, like, again, the facts of the case pushing us towards complexity, and so many people rejecting that and being like, no, you're on my side. Pick a side. To open up a rabbit hole on Israel Palestine on after October 7th, the one thing that I found myself craving was for people to be able and I think people like me who like to operate in this space of
Mhm.
promoting understanding between Israelis and Palestinians, um, that that was such that was the monumental task, was persuading people that not only can they, but should they, but they should be able to hold the two competing ideas that so many people refuse to hold together at the same time, which were, one, what Hamas did in targeting, in killing so many civilians and taking them hostage was terrible. And it's really bad that Israel is killing all these civilians in Gaza, and up to 70,000 people. Um, I think I can hold both of those things at the same time. And in fact, so many people I've talked to, and friends in the Jewish community who were sort of felt lost in their own communities because they felt those things. They felt competing things, but they felt they were driven to never condemn Israel in any way possible, only condemn Hamas. And on sort of Palestinian American side, you could never say that Hamas did a bad thing because it means you're wiping away the history and all the context from before that. But I just don't see a way forward if you can't embrace that
If you
complexity.
can't do that.
Yeah.
Well, what I'm struck by, Eric, you introduced the Metro Surge ICE movement here in Minneapolis, and I still find all these weeks later that my voice starts to quiver when I even think about it, because it's not just a story to me, it was a lived experience, right? So thinking about what you've just introduced, Naseem, about October 7th, it's what happened before and what has happened since. I found myself wrestling with what I was alluding to before about truth and what's beneath truth. So truth to me is this concept that erases complexity, right? It distills it down to the essence of that story. And I think underneath truth is often incredible loss and pain.
Yeah.
And fear. Okay. And if you go in there, things start to go out of focus. You start to lose your balance. You feel disequilibrium emotionally, mentally, and otherwise. And in that state, we clamor for something solid. So we go back to certainty, and pretty soon we're right back at truth. But it's not really the truth, it's a truth, right? So is what I'm sharing something that you see in many of the places where you consult and lead? Is that tension between truth, loss, pain, certainty, truth, loss, pain? Is that sort of a triangle of things that you see yourself wrestling with?
I mean, everything shows up in loss, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you have that frame of loss, I'm asking you to sign on to this peace deal. Well, the first thing I'm going to think is, what do I lose as a result of this, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I might lose substantive things, like I might lose the ability to cross this border, or I might lose this piece of land. But then, possibly more significantly, I might lose my sense of identity, because when you take away my enemy, I don't know who I am anymore. Or I might lose my sense of identity because I've been so accustomed to dealing in a certain way or talking in a certain way, and I don't know who I am anymore when I can't talk in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, loss is a huge thing. There's in negotiation, there's a sort of a famous academic who would talk about what is the way out, right? So you need to develop a deal that is so attractive. So he talked about sort of getting pushed into a deal because the situation is so bad. People get pushed into a deal, but then it is up to the negotiators and the people crafting the deal to create a way out of it, so that they can actually carve a better path forward for them. And they have to be able to see gain and not just see loss out of that. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really profound in terms of, everything can be interpreted through the lens of loss.
Through the lens of loss and the pain associated with it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
sorry, Eric. That's also why I think that the processes that we create, the spaces that we create, the containers that we create are so important, because so often those do not exist. And the way that people have discourse is primed, and it's not because we are not so deliberate on the process and the structures in which they're having these conversations, that it's so easy to go towards that loss, to use that, to look at it through the lens of loss. And I'm going to just yell into this microphone, and it's going to feel good, and it's going to reach my base, and that's how I feel about myself. That's how I know myself. When we're working with folks and asking them to take significant steps towards understanding, towards possibly challenging your own narrative and challenging your truth, we have to create a process that is safe for them to do that. You have to create a structure that's safe for them to do that. And something that they're often not used to. Israelis and Palestinians are not even used to seeing each other ever. Palestinians only see Israeli soldiers. Israelis rarely see Palestinians, period. And so that's just this question of, well, if we're going to, of course, everything's going to be seen in the lens of loss if that's how they're communicating through those structures that exist. We have to create new structures for them to actually communicate in a way that these possibilities are not necessarily framed only in terms of loss.
I completely agree. And I'm so glad that we're talking about Israel-Palestine. My rabbi said something that really stuck with me. He said that a peace agreement is meaningless unless each side has truly lived in the other side's pain. And again, sides is simplistic, but that each people has truly lived in the other one's pain in a way that is deeply felt. And when you were talking there, I was just really struck. How can you have that when collective majorities of each people are not really seeing one another as a whole? How do you build structures where that's possible?
Yeah. So often in the context of this conflict, so many people have tried to bridge that understanding gap. So many people have tried to convince Israelis, if you just know what life was like for Palestinians under occupation, you will change your tune. And vice versa. Israelis trying to convince Palestinians, what it's like to live during the second intifada where buses were blowing up. And then other people sort of trying to change the discourse around it and saying that, these sides are not equal and there's a massive power asymmetry, etc. But that is, so I'm not, that statement that you just said from your rabbi, I get the sentiment. I think I disagree with the first part of it, with that sort of peace processes are sort of useless without that compassion, because I don't think we're getting that compassion anytime soon. I don't think we're getting that empathy anytime soon. I think, for one, both sides are traumatized and are actively living trauma every day as we speak. There are missiles falling down on everywhere, on Israel, on the West Bank, on everywhere, on Gaza, of course. Whose missiles depends on what time of day we're talking about, but they're traumatized, and we can't ask them to do like meaningful work of empathizing with another side when a group is traumatized. But you guys can speak much more to trauma than I can. But that's struck me, and there's more and more work in my field that points back to this idea that, well, we can't do any of this conflict resolution crap if you don't address trauma in the first place, and collective trauma in the first place. Mm-hmm. But that's one thing. But two, I think we also have to operate under this assumption that we're still not going to have this empathy. All these structures that I keep talking about that are wonderful, and how we need to all promote understanding and things like that. There's no way I can bring that to scale. It just is, that doesn't happen. And so how can you take any sort of, how can you have these, what some people call the CBMs, the confidence building measures, absent that empathy. And that's where a good peace process actually can do that kind of thing. Baby steps, building those CBMs to just chip away at that and sort of eventually get to a place where you don't necessarily have trust and empathy and all these wonderful things that lead to beautiful coexistence, but you lead to something that you can create something that leads to at least a lack of violence. And one example that people look to a lot is Northern Ireland, where you would still talk to people on the ground. I went to Northern Ireland for a bunch of years in a row, and just recently, like past few years. And every time I would go, the locals would always say, yeah, the Good Friday Agreement or the Belfast Agreement, whichever side you're on, calls it a different thing, was really helpful in stopping the violence. Really monumental thing, amazing thing that we achieved. And by the way, it might fall apart any day now. I kept hearing that. I hear that like today. People keep saying that. And it's because people are still they're still enemies, and we can't expect that they're going to sit there and again, hold hands and walk into the sunset together. So what do you do despite this idea? And they figured out how to live without violence, and they really don't want to go back to violence. That's what people keep saying. Like, we just can't go back there.
So I want to pick up on that. First, I want to just share a humorous irony that I noticed. You talked about CBMs, confidence building measures, and I thought, hey,
Continental ballistic missiles.
ICBMs, interpersonal confidence building measures. I love those kind of ICBMs.
Yeah.
Anyway, the paradox that I was struck by in relation to your rabbi's comments, Eric, are that I think for me and in my clinical work, I would take almost the opposite position. It's not that I have to really live in your pain, but I have to delve more deeply into my pain, my loss, and then see that I don't want to continue to live in that horrible place. I don't want to keep living in that pain. I have to validate my own pain and then be able to experience that I want a way out. And that may be a way in which I begin to look at, oh, maybe you're also in pain. I don't know about your pain, but it seems to start with almost a deeper dive into my experience as a prerequisite for then someday, some way, being able to connect with your experience. So, Naseem, is that a counterpoint for you relative to what Eric shared that his rabbi was saying?
And just so I'm understanding, the idea of that I need to be able to investigate myself first. I need to want to not live with this pain of myself. That's what I'm hearing?
Yes, I'll give you an example. Going back more years than I care to count. When I was an undergrad,
I'm not keeping track.
Okay. When I was an undergrad, I worked with a researcher who was working with the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. Okay. And she was investigating why in the world is there such a much higher than average base rate of eating disorders among the granddaughters of Holocaust survivors.
Huh.
So you start to get into this question of intergenerational trauma. And then when you investigate the narratives that are alive and well and repeated over and over in those families, it's very much a never again, never again, never again, never again, never again. All legitimate. But it's sort of doubled down on that's why I can't trust. That's why they remain the enemy. That's why I can't. That's why I never will.
Yeah.
So there's a whole set of closed-ended results from that way of carrying the pain. But if I look at the fact that I went through the camps, I came to the US, I've raised different children, now I have grandchildren, but they're in a different way perpetuating my pain in the third generation. Enough already. How do I acknowledge but not perpetuate? Right? That's what I was alluding to. Is there a way that going into the pain can actually help you say, I want something bigger and better for all of us? So
I mean,
that's what I was alluding to.
that's a great example. And that's the requirement. That's what we're learning more and more, that's what's required. We can
Okay.
come in with all of our fancy sort of negotiation problem solving techniques.
Hmm.
If we're not addressing the trauma that is passed down from generation to generation, we're not going to be actually addressing the real issues here. I'm reminded of refugee camps in Lebanon, Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. I've been to them. They're terrible, such hard conditions that people live in. And in so many of these camps, these were Palestinians displaced from 1948, from the creation of Israel in the Nakba, or in 1967, or whenever. And they're living in these sort of shanty towns in the middle of Beirut. But they have kids now, and they've had kids. Their kids have kids, and their kids have kids have kids. And across the generations, they keep passing down the keys from their original houses in Palestine, and they hang them on the wall. And in so many of these houses, these apartments, these sort of shacks and camps like Shatila and Burj Berlejne and camps like that, they have them on the wall, and they're just this constant reminder of this place that your forefathers and mothers came from, that you will never get to go to. And wouldn't it be great? And that's what your goal in life should be, is to go back to that place where your grandmother was. And it's devastating. Cause I'm not sure. It feels like it's just holding them back. Right. And I never want to discount that trauma. It is something that it just seems so much bigger than us that I don't know how to deal with. And it does give me a sense of like, oh my gosh, like, how do we handle this? And I don't know. So I'm looking to you guys for answers on that one. And then the question for people like me is, okay, so what can we get done in the face of that? When there isn't active live trauma happening right now, like missiles falling on us, when it is a bit of a quieter time, but that trauma still exists, what can we actually get done?
Well, I'm so glad that you gave that example. It's incredibly evocative, and it connected to a piece of the historical narrative that I have often lingered on. And I think it's because it kind of happened at a time that I was kind of coming of age and had traveled to that region. And that's the narrative of why the Oslo Accords fell apart at this kind of big moment of truth. And you've heard different perspectives on it. As and you may disagree with this, I think as objective and factually as I can be, one thing that I've understood was that there was this kind of moment of truth where the Israeli side had offered 94, 95, whatever the percentage was of the pre-67 lines with land swaps. And there was a sticking point on the right of return. And ultimately, Arafat could not, did not, however you want to say it, decide to agree to that. And I'm genuinely saying that in a way that is not trying to establish one narrative or rather seek blame or ascribe intentions. But when you were telling that story, I was really trying to put myself in Arafat's shoes and imagine, what a heavy burden to have to tell your people that you're not going to be able actually to take those keys and put them into the homes that you originally had. And I think a similar example could be used with Netanyahu, and with people in his government who have made all kinds of promises to their people that are just not possible in reality, or certainly not possible in a way that is going to lead to collective peace and well-being. Promises about having all of the land, promises about certain biblical possibilities coming to fruition. So I guess I think I'm asking a question. Maybe I'm making a statement. How do you help leaders who have these, you know, these moments that so few of us get, where they're faced with an impossible choice of accepting a truth that will be hard to convey to their people? I'm thinking of Sadat and the 81 Accords with Egypt and Israel. How do you convince them to make that impossible choice, and how do you help them to explain that to their people?
Yeah, it's such a huge question. Um, just on the first part, just reacting to the first part, I do think that there is such a difficulty in making any sort of progress whatsoever without acknowledgement of any past wrongdoings. This is why the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa is so unbelievable and so effective. Um, and and just they understood the power of how the past and wrongdoings becomes the future if it's not properly dealt with. So you can offer Arafat 99%, and because without any acknowledgement, that 1% is going to be the sticking point, right? He'll say no because it's not the full thing, because you don't have an acknowledgement, right? And that we keep discounting that. We keep discounting like the lack of acknowledgement around things that have happened in the past. And so it's so powerful when there are reckonings around that. When Australia, apologizes for how it treated the native population, and things like that. There's so much power in that, because it's and it's maybe it's self-serving. Maybe they're like, it's not. It doesn't even have to be genuine necessarily. It can be like, look, we can't keep living like this. We have to do something better. Okay, yeah, let's apologize or something. But even that is better than just nothing. And so, as a way to move forward, people in I have family members who. So we are Palestinian American. My parents fled in 1948, and we have a family friend who says often, I want the right. I don't need the return. Right. I just need the right. I need the option to go back. I probably won't. I have a really nice life, on the East Coast here in America. I just want the right. And I think that's a relatively common sentiment. Some people would absolutely go back if they could. And that's a scary thought to many Israelis, of course. But again, it just speaks to the power of just gestures and symbolism and acknowledgement. And in terms of bringing your own people, I mean, I think a great example is back to Northern Ireland, where there was a remarkable thing where you had former IRA leaders. Martin McGuinness is the one that comes to mind, who suddenly could turn to his people, whose identity was based on being in the IRA and fighting the Brits, and say, yeah, you know what, folks, there's actually a lot of good stuff that this deal can offer us. And then, 7 years later, they put down their guns. And it's pretty remarkable how that is necessary for anything to happen productive. And it's so difficult. And you have to just really be sort of in awe of those people who can do that.
And I want to summarize two things you said there, because I think for anyone who's listening, and hopefully difference makers, these are two key pillars, right? One is being able in a convincing way to your constituencies to be able to talk and compellingly about how this difficult decision will benefit you. It's communicating it. And the second thing is acknowledgement. Like, what is a real acknowledgement? What is an acknowledgement that's not just going to feel like a platitude, but it's going to feel like something that has depth?
And without that acknowledgement, I think we get continually trapped by what we were talking about earlier, which is this frame of loss. Everything is going to be represented as loss, and you get the push towards being on which other side, and you get the loss of complexity and nuance. One just quick story on this, which I think is powerful and probably says why I do the work I do. I mentioned that my parents both fled Palestine in 1948. My dad's mom has this story, which is she fled very much in accordance with the Palestinian, a very common Palestinian narrative, which was that they were terrorized. By if you look at the groups at the time, the Haganah, the Stern Gang, etc., they probably considered terrorist groups, and she felt terrorized. And indeed, like the last straw was when bullets entered their house, and above the sort of the bed of my dad and his brother in the bedroom, and they hit the ceiling. And so that at that point, she's like, "I'm out," and they took their family, my dad and his brother, and they fled. And that fits nicely with the Palestinian narrative. Where it gets messy is that on the Israeli narrative, a lot of times a common narrative is if the Palestinian leaders and the Arab leaders in general were saying, you go away for 2 weeks and then we will get rid of the Jews and then you come back. You'll come back after 2 weeks after we get rid of them. And my grandmother would say, like, yeah, they absolutely said that. that was one of the reasons why we left at that time, because we thought we'd be back, because they thought that life would be much better when we came back, because they promised us. By the way, on her way out, her neighbor, who was Jewish, and her good friend was offering her sort of safe passage, or sort of saying, you can come stay with us. And my grandmother sort of politely declined. But those are both her story fits in both of these narratives, and allows for, like, it says, like, we're not going to have an understanding of this conflict if you can't embrace both of those things, right? If you can't just truly acknowledge what's happened and have that acknowledgement not just neatly fit into one of these buckets. That's why there's got to be this sort of across stories. Like, we can't just tell our histories according to whichever side we're on. We've got to just tell the histories.
And holding those two things together is incredibly emotionally uncomfortable.
No, totally.
We heard, Eric, you and I heard from one of our recent guests a different focus of acknowledgement, a different type of acknowledgement, when we heard what may be a true story or perhaps an apocryphal story about a way of creating a shared acknowledgement. And it comes from the breakup of Yugoslavia, where Jimmy Carter, was in a room with Slobodan Milosevic and others, some of whom were later accused of war crimes, right? But before that happened, they were sitting around a table trying to figure out how to negotiate. And Carter doesn't talk about politics. He reached into his wallet and he took out a photograph of Amy, his daughter, and he starts passing it around. And people came forward and began to admire Amy, this young daughter at the time. And then they reached into their pockets and took out pictures of their family members. And it was not long before these people were sitting around the table talking about sharing with their families and the people they love and want to protect and they want a future for. And then, according to the story, Carter said, unless we get something done, they're never going to grow up and have a life. So he first engaged them in an acknowledgement of anticipated loss that they all shared, although they were coming at it from, as you say, Eric, from different sides, right? But in that shared anticipation of losing what they all love, there was room to move forward. So I'm curious, Naseem, your reaction to that as a form of acknowledgement, one of the pillars that you've said is so critical.
Yeah. I think that's great. Again, framing it in that sense of loss and just being honest about what this looks like to them, and our ability, sort of a third party's ability to get in their shoes and imagine what this looks like for them.
Yeah.
I've heard that story. I've heard Carter that in the context of the first Camp David Accords.
Interesting.
And it sounds like a common tactic. And that was the same exact thing where he was asking Sadat and Begin to take massive risks, and in the same way, like, let's frame this as, let's acknowledge the loss that this possibly represents. And it was a huge loss. I mean, Sadat, you could argue, was killed for it. So that matters.
Eric, I don't know about you, but I feel like we should schedule a lunch break and then continue, and then a lunch break and then continue the next day and continue for the next week.
Well, I don't know. I'm not ready to stop. How much time do we have to work with here?
I do have a commitment in a little bit, in like 10 more minutes.
Okay.
I do have to, I have the kid thing I got to deal with.
Editorial note, David, we'll edit this part out. But let's work with a 10-minute framework.
Okay.
So, do we want to briefly touch on applications to polarization in the U.S.? Does that feel like too much? Would it be helpful to ask a kind of lighter but also apropos question to our show of transforming relationships, for you to talk a little bit about your interest in music and how that may be relevant? Like, what would be a nice way to kind of transition out here?
For me, I think that the polarization aspect, I think, is pretty important, and not necessarily leading us down a rabbit hole of despair the way Israel-Palestine can tend to do.
Okay.
So I would go in that direction.
Okay, great. So this will
All
be
right, so we're at 111. Okay, got it.
Okay. So maybe this is an apt time to transition back to the U.S. I will share a story that I think could be relevant. Our last guest, pain psychologist David Patterson, he spent most of the interview talking about pain. And then at the end, he talked about a very different kind of pain, which is that he had lost his son tragically. And, we're still figuring out this whole podcast and how to get the word out. And I posted a little clip of this on social media and was just absolutely floored by the response this got. And one of the things I noticed in the comments was you had some people who had American flags prominently in their kind of picture threads. You had other people who had, quote unquote, progressive icons on there. And it was clear that this was something that was resonating kind of across camps. And I wanted to share that anecdote because what struck me was that there are certain universal themes that just touch people's humanity. And I'm curious, in your work, how that might be a path forward and how we try to bridge the divide in our country.
My response to that, whether there are universal themes that can touch on our common humanity, is obviously, like, yes, of course. Like, the connection between human beings is undeniable. Whether you are have been living under a rock for 30 years or whether you are red or blue or whatever, like, yeah. And to me, that's not the problem. The problem is not finding those themes. The problem is creating the structures to allow them to come out. And that's what we don't do enough of. I don't think that we are as deliberate as we could be around creating those spaces where people can actually allow themselves the opportunity to see that common humanity in others. I'm not saying that I don't think that the common humanity does not exist. It's always existing, and it's just how do we harness it? And so it's obviously, I'm not just going to sit here and sort of throw social media under the bus, but of course that makes it harder because we all live in vacuums and we all live in echo chambers, and we all just like the dopamine rush when we get validation from something we say from people who agree with us. And it takes effort, and it's exhausting, and it's oftentimes traumatic to deal with people who disagree. And can we do that in a way that's in a better structure? Social media, nothing good has come out of political conversations happening over Facebook, right? Nothing good. Show me an example. Like once in a rare while, you'll see someone who shows something, some nice clip, and everyone, and what happened with you, Eric, and posting that clip. Like, I think that's pretty rare on social media. And so what are the structures that we can use? What are the places? And this is why, like, I'm now on the board of an organization called Urban Rural Action, where the whole idea is to bridge differences between Americans, and create the spaces for them to do that. It's why some of the stuff we're doing in Israel, Palestine is just focused on the space. We use that word so often, space. How do you create the space? How do you cultivate the space? How do you nurture the space? I'm not sure what that looks like. That takes on different forms in the US here. But I just think it's always a question of how do you be more thoughtful around creating these places and then sustaining them.
What would be examples of spaces and structures? I think I understand how you're using the words, but I just want to ask you maybe to get a little bit more detail oriented with it so that our audience can imagine that.
Yeah. Well, for one thing is, and again, this requires time and effort, but any of the programs that one of these organizations is doing, like Urban Rural Action, where they get people together in a room, and often they're red and blue, and often they're urban and rural, which is a huge divide in this country between urban and rural. And they get them working together, working on something, working on an issue that affects both of their communities, whether it's financial literacy or access to housing or whatever it is. But something where they can just work together and just be in the same space together. And then the sort of politics comes from there. And yes, as I mentioned earlier, the importance of training around that, like how do you build a common vocabulary so that when they're doing the working, they can actually use that common vocabulary and be a bit more productive in that sense when the politics does come up. Another space to do this is on campuses. Campuses have an incredible convening power that aren't harnessed enough. We're doing work at Northwestern University where we're getting together people and training them in how to have hard conversations on campus. So whether it's through actual like programming, but it also doesn't need to be so formal. It can just be like making an effort to have a beer with someone that you disagree with, and do it in a place where you can feel okay, not just trying to lecture, not just trying to educate them, but trying to truly hear them and trying to truly like say like that point makes sense, right? Because we're not going anywhere if there isn't this shared sort of like, hey, if I were in your perspective, I would think the same thing. If I had your experience, I would think the same thing. Like that kind of language. So I think it could be, so it ranges in the sort of formal spaces through programs that I've mentioned, or just like, no, you do it. Everyone, like no one's going to just give you an embossed invitation. You just go and break out of your echo chamber, get off Facebook for a minute, and start challenging yourself. If you think polarization is a problem in this country, you can actually do something about it. So that's my public service announcement for the Americans.
A couple pieces to that I want to take literally a minute to emphasize. One that I love, which Eric, you and I model in our clinical practice, is that people have resources within themselves that they don't realize that they have, that they can harness for positive change. That's one. The second is what I alluded to when we were first starting, given my background in brain science, that there's top down stuff.
Yep.
And we're not in an era where the top down messaging from the leadership of the country or other countries is particularly supportive of non polarization. Much of the top down messaging is increasingly polarizing. And so, what I heard you say is the opposite, which is the bottom up. Campuses, beer halls, neighborhoods, people can come together, and there is power in that unity that may work its way up and out. And that's a hopeful message at a time when we look at the headlines and we say, oh my God, where did the world that we know go? Right?
Yeah.
So I want to thank you for that perspective.
Yeah, and to your point with place, there are many meanings of that word. Place is an actual physical space we can meet at. Imagine if differing groups understood that there was a meeting place that was going to be a place that was one where people brought their better angels, where they brought their curiosity. But place is also being in an inner space, an inner place where you go into it knowing, okay, this is safe enough. This is comfortable enough to engage in ways that might make me uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
Let's try to create those places.
Yeah, that's what I'm hearing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us and for such a thought-provoking conversation today, Naseem. We are so grateful. We know our audience is as well.
Thanks, guys. This was, such great questions, and it got me thinking a lot. So I feel like I have a lot of writing to do after this conversation. It's great.
So a quick
thank you for
comment.
doing this, and thank you for giving a platform to a lot of these ideas.
And speaking of platforms, if our audience wants to follow you afterwards, we mentioned the Substack at the beginning. Can you tell everyone what that is again, and if there are other avenues that they can connect with you?
Yeah. It's a Substack I just created relatively recently, so there's not that much traction. But it's a place for me to it's called Fight Well, and it's sort of thoughts on our discourse and how we can all just sort of fight a little bit better. And it touches on a lot of the things that we've been talking about. It's just a place where I can put some thoughts on how we can have these more constructive things, whether it's about the spaces that we're creating or whether it's about the tools that we're using or the skills that we're using, and why is it so hard? But I want to really identify. I don't want to just be prescriptive and just say like you should listen more, which we should, and we should be more curious. And I want to know like why is that so hard? What's so hard about that? Like if it was easy, we'd all be doing it, but we're not. So why not? So it's sort of grapples. It's my own thinking around questions like that.
Fantastic. That's great. Well, thank you. Thank you.
Cool.
So Naseem, it is always great when I notice that I have really high expectations that get exceeded.
Cool.
So even more than I thought and hoped for. So again, thank you for the work you're doing, and also just thank you for this discourse, for this conversation. I think it was the governor of Utah who said not to fight well, but he said something about we have to disagree better, or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So it's in that spirit that I think you're writing on your Substack. I'll look forward to reading that.
David, what a fascinating conversation. And I think what made that work so well was not only how emotionally accessible Naseem was, but the to use the word that he conveyed so much, how nuanced the points were that he was making. What did you think?
I very much appreciated the discussion we had about resisting the impulse to reduce complexity, which I think is a variation of nuance. What he deals with, what you and I deal with, what our audience deals with, are complex lives. At whatever level we're talking about that complexity. And I really appreciated the way he talked about how you build from simplistic, simple answers to more nuanced answers that capture the complexity. And the particular story, anecdote he shared that captured that was the story passed down through at least 3 generations of his grandmother as she was fleeing her homeland, at the time Palestine, and the interaction with her Jewish neighbor. So it really highlights there are a lot of people who had shared experiences and opposite experiences and the tragedy that followed. I thought that was complexity in a lived way.
Absolutely. And I first thing agree with you. Those however many minutes that anecdote was, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, were the most powerful of the whole interview.
Mm-hmm.
And, we often talk about in psychology intergenerational trauma. But
Mm-hmm.
what about intergenerational complexity? Because for his grandmother to be able to convey both of those narratives,
Mm-hmm.
that takes a lot of strength. Now, what I'm not 100% sure was there something in their back and forth in which she
Yeah, I'm not sure.
kind of conveyed both of those experiences, but to just be able to, in a family discussion, kind of speak to the uncomfortableness between both of those
Mm-hmm.
narratives and to have them live together is really powerful. I also wanted to draw attention to a rhetorical device that he was using throughout the interview that I just thought was so sophisticated. He would make a statement and then he would sort of pause for a beat and then he would say, and then he would say something that cognitively did not necessarily fit with
Yep.
that. It made me think about our show and what we're really trying to do here on transforming relationships, which is hold uncomfortable truths and experiences together that might not coexist so well, but to really make an effort to
I
hold.
very much agree. Yeah, it's a binding of what came before and what came after, with and in the middle somewhere, with a pause on either side. The word that I heard a lot was the importance of acknowledge,
Mm-hmm.
right? And being a bit of a nerd when it comes to the etymology of words, the prefix AC, like acknowledge, AC, knowledge, it means to turn toward knowledge. So I thought, if we can acknowledge what we're saying is we're turning toward a different knowledge, a different way of knowing, maybe a more complex, nuanced way of knowing that binds together different individual narratives that are oppositional in a way where they can perhaps someday, some way come together. So that was a takeaway from me.
Well, what a great place to end our show. May we all endeavor for that.
So, real quickly, Eric, you are so good at summarizing where people can follow our show. You want to quickly pass that along?
Well, you can, of course, email us at transformingpodcast@gmail.com. And this is the part on our YouTube video where transformingpodcast@gmail.com will float across the screen. Let it float into your conscious and subconscious mind. We'd love to hear from you. And of course, you can find both David and I on, as we were talking about with Naseem, the dreaded social media platforms as well. And that's where you can engage with short form clips from our show. And, as David and I are both discovering, whether you're listening to us on Apple and Spotify or watching us on YouTube, our YouTube channel, which I think is transforming relationships, is just a great repository of all of the video of our shows and all of the shorts of our shows. And it's also going to be, as we put this together, a place where we can collect your information if you want to keep in touch with us, so we can let you know about exciting developments in the future.
Thank you, Eric. That's what I needed. All right. Be well. Take care, everybody. We'll talk to you again soon.
As always, thank you so much for tuning in. We look forward to catching up with you again in our next episode. A quick reminder, while we are both doctors of psychology, this podcast is not a substitute for professional medical advice, does not offer diagnoses, or engage you in actual treatment. The conversations, the opinions of our guests, and any information that we share here are meant for your general knowledge, your learning, your inspiration, and your motivation to put some of our ideas into practice in your day-to-day life. Remember that everybody's body and everybody's personal health journey is different, so what works for one person may not be right for the next or for you. If you have questions about your health, any psychological or medical condition, or any changes that you're thinking about making to your lifestyle, your diet, your exercise routine, your medications, or some other aspect of your life, it's always best to talk with a qualified healthcare professional who knows your personal history. Never ignore or delay professional advice because of something you heard here with us. We want you to enjoy the show and to walk away with useful insights, but ultimately, you are responsible for your own health decisions. Please use your best judgment, stay curious, and always listen to your body. Take care, be well,